Functions of the nervous system. Receiving sensory input. Sensory receptors monitor numerous external and internal stimuli. Integrating information. The major organs involved in the processing of sensory input and initiating responses are the brain and spinal cord. Controlling muscles and glands. Skeletal muscles normally contract when stimulated by the nervous system. Maintaining homeostasis. This particular function is dependent on the system's ability to detect, interpret, and respond to the changes in internal and external conditions. Establishing and maintaining mental activity. The brain is the center of mental activity, including consciousness, memory, and thinking. Divisions of the nervous system. The nervous system has two major divisions: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The former consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the latter consists of all the nervous tissues outside the CNS. The central and peripheral nervous systems work together to transmit and process sensory input and organize bodily functions. The brain is connected to the eyes, ears, and other sensory organs, as well as the head and neck muscles, by 12 pairs of cranial nerves. From the spinal cord, 31 pairs of spinal nerves branch out to tissues in the thorax, belly, and limbs. Cells of the nervous system. Glial cells and neurons are two types of cells that make up the nervous system. Neurons are in charge of detecting and interacting with other neurons. The neuron is composed of the following components: cell body or soma. This contains the nucleus, the neuron's intracellular organelles, and it is also the location for cellular metabolism. Dendrites. These originate from the soma and extend outwards. Schwann cells. These insulate the axon, which aids with rapid transmission of action potentials through the axon. Axon terminal. These make synaptic connections with other neurons. They contain various neurotransmitters, which are released into the synapse to allow signals to be transmitted from one neuron to the next. Axon. It arises from the soma from an area called the axon hillock, where action potentials are initiated. Glial cells help nourish, insulate, and extract waste products from neurons. Astrocytes are star-shaped glial cells within the brain and spinal cord. Depending on the method used, they make up between 20 and 40% of all glial cells. Oligodendrocytes. These cells are responsible for insulating the axons in the central nervous system. Microglial cells. They are activated in response to tissue damage. If needed, microglia are also able to function as antigen-presenting cells. Ependymal cells. The ependyma is the thin lining of the ventricular system of the brain and the spinal cord. The main function of these cells is the production of cerebrospinal fluid or CSF as a part of the choroid plexus.
The resting membrane potential is established by the uneven distribution of charge in an unstimulated cell, meaning it's polarized. There is higher concentration of sodium ions outside and higher concentration of potassium ions inside the cell. This means that the outside of the cell is more positively charged compared to the inside. The sodium-potassium pump establishes and maintains this electrochemical gradient. For every 2 potassium ions pumped into the cell, 3 sodium ions are pumped outside. When the cell is stimulated, sodium ion channels and the charge inside the membrane increases, or it depolarizes. The charge needs to reach a threshold in order for an action potential to trigger, at about negative 55 millivolts. Side note, the action potential is all or none. If the stimulus isn't strong enough, the local potential disappears without being conducted. Action potentials are of the same magnitude. Stronger stimulus only means greater frequencies of action potentials. The influx of sodium ions massively depolarizes the cell up to about 40 millivolts. Thus, the action potential then occurs, sending the electrical signal across the axon. Actually, this can simply be called a brief reversal of charge across the membrane. To rebalance the charges, repolarization takes place. The voltage-gated potassium ion channels open up and potassium ions flow out. There's a brief period of hyperpolarization when too much potassium ions flow out, but the sodium-potassium pump reestablishes it back to the resting level. The cell then enters a refractory period in which it cannot respond to any other stimuli. Once the electrical signal travels to the end of the axon, it reaches the synapse, a junction where communication between neurons takes place. There are 2 types of synapses, electrical and chemical. The much less common electrical synapses conduct action potentials through gap junctions, structures that act as tunnels to directly connect the cytosols of 2 cells. Chemical synapses, on the other hand, are more abundant, precise, and selective, but are much slower. Neurotransmitters that diffuse in the synaptic cleft are used to deliver the electrical message. Chemical synapses involve the release, diffusion, and reception of neurotransmitters. The presynaptic neuron transmits the signal to the axon terminal. There is a gap between this and the postsynaptic neuron called the synaptic cleft. The presynaptic neuron contains neurotransmitters packaged inside vesicles. Once an action potential reaches the axon terminal, voltage-gated calcium ion channels are opened. Calcium ions enter the cytoplasm, and it triggers exocytosis in the vesicles as they bind onto the synaptotagmin in the vesicles. Neurotransmitters diffuse into the synaptic cleft and bind to specific neurotransmitter receptors found in the postsynaptic neuron, either to ionotropic or metabotropic receptors. This opens the ion channels, and ions flow across the membrane, creating postsynaptic potential. The neuron may get excited or inhibited depending on the neurotransmitter that binds the receptor. Neurotransmitters that depolarize the postsynaptic membrane are excitatory as they bring the membrane closer to the threshold. The graded potentials responsible for this are called excitatory postsynaptic potentials, or EPSPs. Inhibitory neurotransmitters hyperpolarize the neuron by making the inside more negative, lowering the charge away from the threshold. This hyperpolarizing postsynaptic potential is called the inhibitory postsynaptic potential, or IPSPs. The sum of excitations and inhibitions will determine if an action potential will be generated or not. When the threshold is reached, an action potential in the axon of the postsynaptic neuron is triggered. After this, the neurotransmitters get dealt with in various ways. Some undergo reuptake by getting absorbed by the presynaptic neuron, some are degraded by enzymes, and some are diffused away from the synapse.
The central nervous system. Spinal cord provides a two-way conduction pathway to and from the brain. It controls many reflex activities of the body. Spinal nerves is a path of communication between the spinal cord and specific regions of the body. Pons resembles an arched footbridge. It relays information between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Pons regulates respiration, swallowing, and sleep. Midbrain is the smallest region of the brainstem. This is one of the most important components of the CNS, as all neuronal transmissions that pass through the body throughout the PNS to the CNS are relayed, at some point pass from the brain through the midbrain. Reticular formation is a group of nuclei scattered throughout the brainstem, regulating cyclical motor functions such as respiration, walking, and chewing. A reticular activating system plays an important role in arousing and maintaining consciousness. Any damage can result in coma. The following are the parts of the encephalon. Thalamus makes up 80% of the diencephalon, consisting of paired oval masses of gray matter organized into nuclei with interspersed tracts of white matter. It influences mood and registers an uncomfortable perception of pain. The interthalamic adhesion connects the two large lateral parts of the thalamus. Epithalamus is the smallest area superior and posterior to the thalamus that consists of pineal gland and habenular nuclei. A pineal gland is an endocrine gland that secretes hormone melatonin, while habenular nuclei is involved in olfaction, especially emotional responses to odors. Hypothalamus is the most inferior part. Sensory related to both somatic and visceral senses arrive at the hypothalamus, as do impulses from receptors for vision, taste, and smell. It controls and integrates activities of the ANS, which regulates contraction of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Hormones produced in the hypothalamus are corticotrophin-releasing hormones, dopamine, growth hormone-releasing hormone, somatostatin, gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, and thyrotrophin-releasing hormone. Cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. Its primary function is to evaluate how well movements initiated by motor areas in the cerebrum are actually being carried out. When movements initiated by the cerebral motor areas are not being carried out correctly, the cerebellum detects the discrepancies. It sends feedback signals to motor areas of the cerebral cortex through its connections to the thalamus. Cerebrum is the largest and most prominent part of the brain. It is also called the seat of intelligence. It provides the ability to read, write, and speak, make calculations, compose music, to remember the past and plan for the future, and to create. The lobes under cerebrum are the following. Frontal lobe is the control of voluntary motor functions, motivation, aggression, mood, and olfactory reception. The primary motor area consciously moves your skeletal muscles, the Broca's area is the speech center, and prefrontal area is for executive functions. Parietal lobe is the general sensory area that receives info from the sensory receptors in the skin and joints, while the Wernicke's area for the sensory speech area. The occipital lobe is the receiving and perceiving visual input. The primary visual area receives visual info, and the visual association area is a portion where visual info is integrated. Temporal lobe. The primary auditory area is the center for reception of auditory messages. The auditory association area is where auditory messages are integrated, and the psychic cortex is the abstract of thoughts and judgments. The peripheral nervous system refers to all nervous tissue outside the central nervous system. The following are the structures under PNS. Ganglia, small masses of nervous tissue consisting primarily of neuron cell bodies located outside of brain and spinal cord. Cranial nerves emerges from the brain. Spinal nerves emerges from spinal cord. And enteric plexuses are extensive networks of neurons located in the walls of organs of the gastrointestinal tract. Sensory modalities integrates the functions of these sensory receptors. It is broken down into two types: general senses and special senses. General senses refer to both somatic and visceral senses. In somatic senses, it includes tactile, thermal pain, proprioceptive sensations, while visceral senses provide info about conditions within the internal organs. Special senses refers to smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium or balance. PNS has specialized cells called sensory receptors, which extends to CNS to communicate to other parts of the body. These receptors respond to stimuli and changes of the environment. Sensation is a function of the low-level biochemical and neurological mechanisms that allow the receptor cells of the sensory organ to detect an environmental stimuli. Sensory processing, or also known as integration, is the effective registration and accurate interpretation of sensory input in the environment. It is the way the brain receives, organizes, and responds to sensory input in order to behave in a meaningful and consistent manner. The PNS itself is divided into two parts: the somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system consists of sensory neurons that convey information to the CNS from somatic receptors in the head, body wall, limbs, and from receptors for vision, hearing, taste, and smell, and motor neurons that conduct impulses from the CNS to skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for the involuntary parts of the body. It regulates glands and muscles, such as the muscles in the skin, around blood vessels, in the intestines, stomach, and bladder, and also the heart or the cardiac muscle. The ANS is most important in the situations fight or take flight, and rest and digest. The ANS is divided into three parts: sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is always active. It is not only working during the situations fight or flight or rest and digest. It works with the body's somatic nervous system and essential to maintain the body's normal internal functions. The sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for situations requiring alertness or strength, or situations that arouse fear, anger, excitement, or embarrassment, or what we call the fight or flight situations. What happens here? The sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate by stimulating cardiac muscles, increases oxygen intake by causing dilation of the bronchioles of the lungs, and increases the blood supply through the dilation of blood vessels, which supply the heart and skeletal muscles. Because social conflicts can also trigger the sympathetic system, the chronic stress of modern life may result in sympathetic overstimulation and its associated long-term effects. The parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of the periods of rest and digestion. It decreases respiratory rate, pulse, and blood pressure. It also conserves energy by relaxation and rest. The cell bodies of the parasympathetic nervous system are found in the spinal cord or in the sacral region and in the medulla. To help you recall how or where the parasympathetic nervous system works, here is an acronym. Salivation. As part of its rest and digest function, the PSNS stimulates production of saliva which contains enzymes to help your food digest. Lacrimation. It means producing tears. These help protect the delicate tissues in our eyes. Urination. It contracts the bladder which helps the urine to be released from the body. Digestion. The saliva produced helps with the digestion. It instigates the movement of the stomach and intestines, also called peristalsis, to digest food. Defecation. The sphincters in the intestine contracts and moves digested food material down the digestive tract so the person can excrete their waste. The enteric nervous system is a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system that directly controls the gastrointestinal system. The ENS has efferent neurons, afferent neurons, and interneurons that make it possible for the ENS to carry out reflexes and acts even without the input of CNS. The second brain of the enteric nervous system is the reason we get butterflies in our stomach or need to use the restroom more frequently when we are nervous or under stress. In order to make sense of what is around us, we need our sensory organs. They are responsible for taking in information and conveying it to our nervous system. Then, it will be interpreted as sight, sound, smell, taste, or touch. The eyes are responsible for the sense of sight. How does it help us see? First, the cornea allows the light to enter our eye. From there, the light will pass through the pupil. Then, the iris adjusts how much light would pass through, and the image will be focused onto the retina by the curved lenses. The rods and cones on the retina will be translating the light into nervous signals that will be carried by the optic nerve to the brain for it to be interpreted as visual images. Now, let us hear about the ear. The outer ear moves the sound waves down the ear canal to the eardrum or the tympanic membrane. Mechanical vibrations are formed when these waves hit the eardrum that will then send the vibrations to the auditory ossicles. These will carry the vibrations to the inner ear where the cochlea is. Pressure waves in the fluid in the inner ear detected by the specialized hair cells in the cochlea triggers the nervous receptors. The signal will be carried by the cochlear nerve to the brain, which will interpret those as sounds. The skin is responsible for the sense of touch. There are specialized receptor cells within the tissue layers that convey the sensations and signals through the peripheral nerves to the brain. The nose is the sensory organ for smell. Whenever we sniff or inhale through the nose, the chemicals bind to the receptors on the hair-like cilia. Because of that, a signal will be carried to nerve fiber through the epithelium and the skull bone above to the olfactory bulbs. The signal will be transmitted to the olfactory nerves that will then be sent to the olfactory area of the cerebral cortex. Additionally, by using another sense like taste, the smell will be imprinted on the brain's memory. The tongue is the sensory organ we use for our sense of taste. Papillae are the small bumps on the top of the tongue which contains taste buds. The chemicals from the food we eat enter the papillae and reach the taste buds. These chemicals, also called tastants, stimulate specialized gustatory cells inside the taste buds, which in turn activates the nervous receptors. The signals from the receptors will travel to the facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. From there, the signals will be sent to the medulla oblongata that will be sent to the thalamus and cerebral cortex of the brain. Then, the person will be able to react according to the taste.